I was watching Instagram recently, and I saw some content creators making claims about the film A Complete Unknown, shooting at 12,800 ISO on the Sony Venice 2. I've been using this camera since it was released about 3 years ago, and I just had some doubts and questions about what was being claimed there. Had the chance to see that movie in the theater, and I just thought, let's come here to Cine in Fort Worth, Texas, design some tests to understand the nuances of the low light capabilities on the camera, and see if there's a workflow that filmmakers like you and I could use on future projects. I was able to find a series of interviews with Phaedon Papa-Michael, the cinematographer from the film, and he was describing working with James Mangold, the director on the picture, who had the vision to create a very filmic look in the approach to capturing the village in New York City of the 1960s. Phaedon Papa-Michael described capturing the filmic look a couple of different ways. One of them was going to Panavision and working with Dan Sasaki to craft a custom set of anamorphic lenses, actually with the intent of stopping down and shooting between T8 and T11 in order to get deeper focus, being one of the characteristics of shooting on film, particularly in that era. But that creates some technical challenges because so much of the film happens at night in exteriors around the village in New York City. In order to achieve that, they were shooting at around 12,800 ISO. And hearing that, I just had some questions. Sony Venice 2 is a dual base ISO camera of 800 and 3200, so you only have the two ISOs. But with exposure index, you can push or pull the exposure. Not actually what the camera's recording internally, just what you're viewing on your monitor, whether it's your viewfinder, your on-camera monitor, or back at Video Village. An important point, exposure index is not the same thing as ISO. When I adjust the EI on the Sony Venice, or if you're using exposure index when you're shooting celluloid film, you are telling the post-production team to push or pull your exposure. Your two base ISOs are at 800 and 3200. Those change simultaneously. Very, very, very intuitive. Exposure index, though, what's nice is it's going to tell you where your stops are. So I can scroll through here all the way to 12,800 ISO, and that's telling me that I've gained 2 stops of latitude in my highlights. If I go back to 800, there, I can, same thing, plus 2 stops of latitude in my highlights, which takes me all the way to 3,200, and then all the way down to there. One thing I learned from listening to cinematographers like Roger Deakins, for instance, is if you're in a bright environment, Deakins will sometimes rate the camera at a higher ISO. And the reason to do that is to protect your highlights. Because if you're exposing at the higher EI, then you're giving yourselves those extra stops in the highlights to protect the roll-off and avoid clipping. Vice versa, if you're in a very dark environment, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but you would actually adjust your exposure index down. It sounded like what they were doing on A Complete Unknown was actually rating the camera all the way up at 12,800 ISO, which is the highest exposure index that the camera offers. So to run the test in the spirit of the film, A Complete Unknown, we're gonna rig the camera up on a Steadicam with Steadicam operator Nathan Payne. We're gonna go out here onto historic South Main here in Fort Worth, where Cine is located. And then we're gonna swing onto the camera, a lens, and yeah. So we've rigged the Venice up onto, this is the Aero 30 from Steadicam, just to see if we take a tracking shot at these just ambient light levels using what's available in our neighborhood. What is this gonna look like? Is this usable footage? We'll maybe shoot at a few different settings, but then we'll go to the color chart and we'll really test what the sensor's doing at each of the different settings.
To begin our Sony Venice 2 test, we shot some Steadicam footage at the highest resolution possible, XOC NST 8.6K resolution, 3200 base ISO, 3200 exposure index, no ND filter, to gauge how the environment, particularly the lighting, would affect our footage, skin tone, color chart, and grays.
All right, so that was at 3200, zero exposure index. Now, we're gonna push all the way to 12,800. And you can see, actually, if you look at the Steadicam monitor, the difference as I EI up and down, that's 12,800 right there. 3,200 in the white box, that's still our base ISO, that's where we're at, but the exposure index now is the 12,800.
Out of the camera, the ungraded footage looks phenomenal already. Having the 12,800 exposure index, I can visualize the creative aspect of this method as used in the film A Complete Unknown. But I'm a bit curious about the color accuracy dynamic range, and grains on different camera formats. So we rigged up our static shots to further examine the Sony Venice 2.
So Venice is at the second base ISO 3200, rated at 3200. At a T8, can't see anything right now, but our BTS camera is at 10,000 ISO, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 3.5, T35.
At a T35? Okay, so yeah, that's the difference. Stand by, taking the index up to 12,800. All right, we got that. Now we go to ST at exposure index 3200.
We shot several clips with different camera settings, including XOCN XT, ST, LT, ProRes 4444, but things goes different for ProRes 4 22HQ.
Camera speeds, I'll take that marker. There, we got it. Actually, that's worse somehow. Oh. Yeah.
It should be worse.
I mean, I can just tell on this monitor. We're gonna index it this time, 12,800. All right, I'll take that marker. And you can drop that for us. And there we go. Okay. All right, great. I think we have our footage. I am very curious to see what the color chart really looks like when we go in there and crank the RAW up to 12,800. Nothing that we're doing now is really like the camera test that you would do for any type of project. This is purely a technical test. But this isn't telling me like how a skin tone is gonna react when I'm pushing the camera this much, but it'll give us at least some sense of like how much noise is starting to happen in our blacks here. When I was watching the Complete Unknown, they were shooting in an environment not dissimilar to this, but they were using lights to shape, to put light on his face. And because we're not doing that and we're really actively trying to push the camera to its breaking point, I have the sense that none of this is anything that anyone would ever use. But I think the lessons from this would tell you that aspects of this workflow are probably usable. All right, so after filming our tests, I've ingested the footage into the editing system, and now I'm over in the coloring panel with each of the clips that we shot. And we got a mix of the exposure tests over here. You can see the different flavors of XOCN and ProRes that we shot in our tests. And then over here, these are the fun little motion demos that we captured with Will, the rental tech over at Cine, and then Nathan, our Steadicam op. So before anything, this is all just a very basic DaVinci node tree, but there are no corrections except for color space transform at the moment. And this is one of our Steadicam shots. So I'll just check playback. This is ungraded. This is just a basic color space transform. Let's see how that looks. And for a scene that's not lit, I'm seeing the highlights in our scene and just basic street light on Will's face there. And I don't hate it. It's kind of amazing. But what's really interesting, and I really didn't know what was gonna happen to my eye, it was very dark out there. But I'm looking at this at 12,800 ISO. I think this is everything that we were hearing from the interviews with Fade and Papa Michael, and those are just available streetlights hitting Will through all of this. That's kind of amazing. All right, but that raises the question, how does the footage operate when you're pushing it that far? Because if we're doing the exposure math, we're at 12,800 ISO. We've already bumped from the base ISO of 800 to 3200. So hypothetically, you would see a little more grain, but push beyond that, an extra 2 stops. So we should probably get in here and start to pixel peep and see at what point is the footage going to break down. So we'll go over to our exposure test. All right, so I'm kind of pixel peeping here. I'm zooming in all the way to the corner of the frame over here just to see what the grain characteristic and the noise looks like. So I have my noise reduction node opened up. Wow, look at the difference. All right, so let's move on next to the exposure test. And we just threw the color chart up on the sidewalk outside the side of the building. This is unlit. We're just using available light out there, and you can see Nathan has his light meter at T1.4. So that's 5 or 6 stops underexposed, which is a lot. So let's start to kind of push the footage and see where things start to break and if this is recoverable. So I'm gonna pop over into our primaries and just start kind of pushing this. So if I'm lifting my gamma, and I'm kind of looking at my scopes over here, that's getting real funky real fast, right? That is our color chart in this zone. That's our gray. That's breaking already pretty fast. Let's try another strategy. Let's, instead of doing the primaries, if we're over in RAW, in the exposure setting, we go to 12,800. That takes us there. And I think you're still gonna need to push it. So back over in primaries, just keeping an eye on, yeah, that's real funky. I don't think that's usable. Yeah, there's no way, you're so far underexposed. I don't think that's gonna work. All right, XOCN XT, and again, this is the exposure index 12,800. 12,800. Yeah, I don't think that's not gonna work. Although, you know, I mean, to my eye, that's a little interesting. Doesn't look as bad as the ST, which obviously shouldn't be surprising, but it kind of is surprising. Like if I'm looking over in this zone here, you can kind of see my gamma wheel over here. In this zone, this looks good. What's happening here in the gray card, not great, not great. But we know that was under. All right, so if we're in the XOCN LT now, let's look in our RAW viewer. We're just at 3,200. Well, I'll be honest, I don't know how to feel about this. I mean, I feel like there's kind of a version of this that works. I mean, what's happening up here in the scene where we have light feels usable to me. It's very, very dark. Ooh, buddy. And that one, yeah, that clip definitely died. So we're in LT here. This is the last XOCN test. Base ISO 3200. If you're in a situation where you need to push this, it is going to break down by the time you get your exposure back to what normally, you know, would be a normal exposure. There are huge advantages from an exposure perspective to recording in the ST or the XT. Let's look at the ProRes. I'll just copy over the color space transform, all right? There's no noise reduction, nothing else happening here. And already, you can see the exposure difference. There's no recovering this. Oh, it's gone. Pretty much the entire image is buried in the noise floor and not even worth going through the rest of the test. There's nothing you can do here. Even at ProRes 4444, the image is gone. So this is definitely a RAW only XOCN based workflow. Otherwise, you're not getting what the camera can do. I'm looking at this particular clip. I think this is probably the most important one in the whole exposure test. This is the Venice 2 in XOCN XT, the highest level of RAW. You are chewing up a lot of memory card space. But if you know you're gonna be in a scene where you're really pushing to the edge of exposure, like we are here. So we've rated the camera at the second base ISO 3200, exposure index 12,800. The lens is at a T8. You saw the light meter reading, that was a T1.4. Very, very dark out there. If I were to spend some time here in my primaries or in HDR or like a log system, I don't know, it's tough. I mean, parts of the image look great and parts of it are not usable. And I think the lesson that I'm going to take away from this is the 12,800 ISO is very, very usable, and we know it for a fact, right? Obviously, because we've seen the movie, we've seen the results. I had the chance to see the movie in the theater. I think all that's missing from these tests to be usable footage is frankly just sculpting the image with light. Like we purposely put the color chart in a very dark area, and we were purposely trying to break the exposure. But I mean, I'll be honest, to my eye, here in the coloring suite, if I'm looking at this, that's just available light. We haven't lit his face with our movie lights. We haven't done anything to shape or sculpt, but if we were, this feels very usable to me. The underlying assumptions that I had going in about how the exposure index worked on the Sony Venice 2, I still don't fully understand what's going on there, but it looks like the XOCN RAW clips are recording the exposure index as ISO. So yeah, I think if I'm looking back in summary, I'm not even bringing in like a film look emulation, dehancer, or anything else to build the film look, but just the natural noise pattern of the Sony Venice 2 sensor, how it looks under these circumstances. I think there's a lot to think about. It's really intriguing, and I think there are a number of insights and lessons that made this a really valuable test. I think there are clearly creative and technical opportunities that the Sony Venice 2 opens up. So big thank you to Cine here where we ran the test. If you're interested in shooting with the Sony Venice 2, they do have it on their inventory along with the Sony Burano. Yeah, thank you for kind of taking a walkthrough on all of this with me. If you have any of your own questions or insights, things that you want us to follow up on, reach out to us in the comments, and we'll see you on the next one.